on you. Okay, so this here panel slash essay reading is a reprise or however you say it, of a panel I held at othercon in 2021. I've rewritten it because some of the references and some of the dates mentioned were not accurate anymore, but it should be mostly up to date now. So let's just start. The focus of this lecture changed quite a bit since I started working on it. My earliest idea was to discuss the gray area between other links and kin types. In fact, one of my working titles was Gray Zones and Silver Linings. And I do still plan on talking about this, though not in the way you might expect. I originally wanted to argue that those who found themselves in this gray area should be able to choose how they wanted to refer to their identity. But the more research and thinking I did, the more I realized this would still leave a bunch of people torn and confused and wouldn't really solve any of the greater problems in our community. Telling people just to choose whatever feels right doesn't really help them choose. Instead, I went looking for the root of the categorization debacle we have in this community. The non-human community as we know it didn't always exist. And though we often say it has roots in elven communities from the 70s, that's only half the truth. While the Elf Queen's daughters and related successors, such as the Silver Elves, are the earliest known organized non-human communities, they're by far not the only pioneers. Because non-human, sorry, just scroll too far down. Because non-human identifying people have always existed, and our numbers have always been relatively small, some of us ended up grouping together without being aware of the other groups that existed. And of course, all these independently formed groups ended up with their own cultures, traditions, and philosophies. Mailing lists, like the Elfenkind Digest, were generally open for anyone to join and read, but they also weren't widely known or easy to stumble upon for folks who didn't already have an interest in these kinds of spirituality and philosophy. This resulted in a culture where people's self-identification was generally respected, and they would only be grilled if they made extraordinary claims. Compare this with the news group Alt Horror Werewolves, which was open for anyone to access on Usenet, and which was originally created as just a place to discuss werewolf media. On Alt Horror Werewolves, the therians, or wares as it was back then, would frequently have to defend their existence against strangers who just found them by accident. This would lead to a culture more focused on appearing respectable and fighting off trolls, which in turn would lead to a more intense grilling of new members. Other independent groups, such as Old Fan Dragons, also known as Alfandra, which was centered around dragons, or Always Believe, which was centered around unicorns, had their own cultures as well. For example, Alfandra Alfandra generally accepted dragons from modern fiction, which would not have been embraced the same way on Old Horror Werewolves. The Silver Elves is another semi-independently evolved group of elves, fae, and similar beings that still exists to this day. They only represent a fraction of our community, but for today's discussion, I think their writings are pretty relevant. They've written about choice of identity on multiple levels. For starters, they believe a lot of elven spirits have actively chosen to incarnate into human bodies. More provocatively and more interesting to me, they've stated multiple times that simply wanting to be an elf means you are an elf. This is in contrast to the therian community on Old Horror Werewolves, where there was a big focus on involuntary shifts and theorizing on why some people were born with an animal side. I think it's reasonable to assume this focus on involuntary experiences is due to the werewolf narrative that the community stemmed from. In werewolf media, a person's wolfish side is rarely, if ever, a choice, while in New Age and spiritual communities like that of the Silver Elves, there is a greater emphasis on choice of spirituality and subsequently on choice of identity. It wouldn't be right to say that every Therian back then shared the same beliefs. However, The belief that involuntary shifts are a core trait of therianthropy does seem to persist in the Old Horror Werewolves user base. Nearly all introduction posts include a line about having experienced involuntary shifts. Another idea that keeps showing up is that the therian either had a sudden awakening or that they just always knew they were animalistic. Contrasted with the Silver Elves idea that simply wanting to be an elf can be enough for you to be one. It wouldn't, no, sorry, my guinea pig keeps screaming at me. um, there are two main ideas about origins that seem to persist in all of this. That one is either born non human or becomes non human. Both are equally true. The born this way narrative is a bit more common than the becoming narrative, though that's not to say that the idea of becoming non human is rare or even all that controversial in most communities, with a few conditions. The idea that one can become a therian or otherkin tends to rest on the idea that what we become is outside our control. On the more metaphysical side of things, there are stories of people being spiritually transformed into an animal after encounters with an animal spirit, or of having the shard of a god put into them. And on the more mundane side, there are stories of imprinting on a species during early development, or of taking on the experiences of a character after being engrossed in a piece of media. Most people I've talked to don't have a problem with these ideas of becoming as something outside your control. What really gets people's goat therian is when someone describes specific choices they've made during their journey, which ultimately led to their therian or otherkin identity. This finally leads us to the purpose of this essay, the topic of choice itself and how we categorize others based on the perceived amount of choice or chance there's been involved in the development of their identity. Questions I'll discuss include: what kind of choices do we have regarding our identities? What the hell what the hell does choice even mean in this context? And how does the idea of choice or lack of choice affect the way our community functions? There are many kinds of choice. Sorry, got water in the wrong neck hole. There are many kinds of choices that we inarguably do make on our journey of self discovery. Probably the first universal choice in our community are to undertake the journey in the first place and to seek out a community. Choices that naturally follow include choice of labeling, that is, whether we want to call ourselves otherkin, therian, fictionkin, non-human, and so on, and the choice to accept or reject whatever feelings caused us to seek out a community in the first place. In this line of thinking, being otherkin is a choice. You choose to label yourself as otherkin. However, the experiences on which you base this decision are not a choice. The experiences that pushed you towards the community were already there. Another choice that follows pretty naturally in this line of thinking is the choice to strengthen whatever connections you already have. This is something I'm intimately familiar with, as I've been doing it since I awakened as a bison. Before I even became aware of my species identity, I knew I was non-human. I'd been having simultaneous bison and knoll feelings for a few years, but couldn't separate them, and had, without much introspection, decided that I must be some weird kind of canine. I think a lot of us with uncommon stereotypes have gone through a phase like that. However, one day I experienced a very strong flashing image, basically a flashback of being physically a bison. The vision was so vivid and tactile, I immediately knew what it meant. And for the next few weeks, I ignored every experience that wasn't quite bison in nature and just examined the recognizably bovine feelings. This helped strengthen my bison identity, and in total, my questioning process only took about 2 months. Though I've settled in my identity as a bison and I'm comfortable referring to myself as a bison, I never really stopped reinforcing it. While I didn't create the original bison like feelings, I'm very conscious of the fact that I do choose to connect every trait to my bisonhood that I can, whether I see the traits as a cause of my current bisonhood or a result of it. Things like being stubborn and preferring physical fights over verbal ones, and even liking the taste of those bean boozled jelly beans that are supposed to taste like grass. All these traits that any human could have are things that I connect to my identity as a bison. I've experienced some pushback towards this idea from a few therian communities that shall not be named. A very common rebuttal I've run into in introduction threads and grilling threads, which introduction threads should never be grilling threads, in my opinion, but that's another story. A very common rebuttal to considering these traits part of my non human identity is, isn't that just a regular human thing? And I have so many problems with that question. I'm honestly not sure where to begin. Yes, those traits are experienced by humans all the time. I think some of the only experiences in our community that regular humans don't experience are perhaps species dysphoria and shifts. And even then, you could argue about supernumerary phantom limbs and stuff like that. But if your identity began and ended with having dysphoria and experiencing shifts, it would hardly qualify as an identity. Treating an identity like just the sum of its parts, rather than a whole and complicated construct, is reductive, and it doesn't just hinder discussion, it stifles discussion. I don't know, maybe I'm the odd one here, but my whole non human identity cannot be encompassed by my horn dysphoria or the fact that I sometimes feel more like a prey animal than an apex predator. My identity is so much more than that. It's how I view the world and how I view myself in relation to the world. It's how I react to things, what I like and dislike, and what I want out of my life. When you envision an identity in this way, as a way to describe who you are rather than a summary of every individual thing you experience, you absolutely will see some overlap with humans, like it or not. Another reason I dislike the question, aren't those just human traits? Is that it's often asked in communities where the consensus is that you were born non-human and that your identity is somehow more real or valid if it can be corroborated by childhood memories. While looking back at your childhood and seeing how your current identity might have formed or changed throughout the years can help paint a picture of your identity as a whole, that kind of reminiscence should always be secondary to what you're currently experiencing. Your identity is not based on the fact that you played dog when you were a toddler. Pretty much every human child has played dog or been obsessed with cats or wished they were a dragon. It might be related to your current identity, but if those were your primary non human experiences, you would hardly consider yourself non human, nor would you find a home in the community. It's also way too easy to retrofit memories to fit your current self perception. Memories are a lot more malleable than most of us want to admit. No, your identity is a result of who you are right now and what you're experiencing in this moment. The validity of your identity should not be judged based on the number of times you pretended to be that creature in kindergarten. Your kin type should be determined based on your current experiences. And if your current experiences include things that humans can also go through, that should have no impact on the validity of your identity. Okay, back on the topic of choice. Hopefully, we can. Oh my God, one moment, I'm working on a Windows 7 computer, so things are a bit buggy sometimes. So, back to the topic of choice. Hopefully, we can all agree that there's no shame in strengthening your connections, reinforcing what traits you already have, and in drawing connections between a non human identity and ostensibly human traits. Which is a nice segue into a statement that might ruffle a few feathers. Link types are typically based on pre existing traits that are reinforced to fit a certain narrative or ideal. A coping link or an other link is rarely, if ever, pulled out of thin air. You just can't craft an identity from nothing. Crazy, I know. This parallels otherkin identities, which, as I mentioned earlier, are based on pre existing experiences and connections that one chooses to give a name and to reinforce. The process of becoming a linker usually starts with recognizing certain traits that one either wants or already has but wants to reinforce by focusing them through a link type. For example, wanting to become better at handling stress can be difficult to accomplish on its own, but may be made easier by thinking about what a specific character or animal would do in a stressful situation. But you can't just establish a connection to any given character. There needs to be a resonance between you and the link type. And if you don't already have that resonance with the character, it's impossible for you to craft an identity around them. And in that sense, you could easily argue that there is an involuntary aspect to link types. Once the prospective linker has recognized a connection with, for example, a fictional character, they will begin the process of reinforcing the identity, which can include anything from writing fanfics in first person to wearing clothes reminiscent of the character to asking people to treat you like the character. All things that an otherkin or fiction kind might do when first establishing their identity. A key trait of linking is that a link type is voluntary. Logically, the voluntarity should persist, and you should be able to destroy the link if you just ignore it or push it away long enough. However, a significant number of linkers or former linkers have talked about their link type becoming an inseparable part of how they view themselves. Even the ones who might be able to force their link type away would at this point become completely different people if they did so. In other words, their link type has become an integral part of who they are as a person. This integrality can appear regardless of how much effort they put into creating the link type in the first place, and regardless of how non existent the link type was before they created it. What I'm getting at is that some people describe creating an identity from scratch by their own choice, which later becomes an irreversibly ingrained part of them. It's an experience completely contrary to the idea that we are born non human. Um, and from now on, I'll refer to these people as linkers turned kin. There are a few regular rebuttals I've seen to this idea that linkers turned kin just had a late awakening, or that perhaps they felt compelled by their inner true species to seek out the identity, or even that they were actually born non human, they just didn't realize until later. All these rebuttals are disrespectful of the linker turned kin's experiences and intelligence, and honestly, they make me angry. The rebuttals ride on the idea that the born this way idea of non human identities is a universal fact rather than a common experience and or belief. I know that for a lot of people, the born this way narrative rings true. I see you and I'm not trying to invalidate you. Instead, I want you to acknowledge that others may not have the same belief as you. For several people in our community, otherkinity is an identity that develops in response to certain traits they have. For some, those traits are inherent, something they're born with. For others, they're traits that develop later in life or that were worked towards. And I want to argue that for some, these traits were expressly chosen. The reason these arguments against linker turned kin make me so angry, aside from the fact that they're built on the idea that linkers turned kin don't understand their own experiences, and the assumption that your idea of how non human identities work trumps someone else's lived experience. Um, Another reason the arguments make me so angry is that they prescribe more importance to the why than the how of your identity. When you define otherkin by the way our identity formed, you're basically saying that the cause of otherkinity is more important than the experience of otherkinity. We can't talk about this without also exploring the community's animosity towards psychological beliefs. Since writing this essay in 2021, views on psychological otherkin and therians have changed somewhat. at least in the Tumblr corner of our community where I hang out. In fact, recent informal polls have often shown more folks with purely psychological than purely spiritual origins. But I hear that spiritual favoritism still persists in some corners. Through my years in the community, I feel like I've had to handhold some folks through the concept of religious tolerance. I remember back in 2017, someone on Tumblr asked me my opinion on fiction kind. And it would still be another 2 years before I had my own fiction kind awakening. So my response back then was basically that I was fine with fiction kind, though I didn't understand their experiences. And the only way I could fit it into my own worldview was as a psychological phenomenon. And even after my awakening, the latter still holds true. My fiction kinity is primarily psychological. But yeah, somehow my statement that I didn't believe fiction kinity was caused by past lives ended up being twisted into me saying that fiction kind were all just role players. Um, Rereading the whole debacle that ensued, this twisting of my words had little to nothing to do with my own personal beliefs. It instead exposed a widespread antipathy towards psychological otherkin. When I have talked about my current experiences as a Knoll, my shifts and my flashbacks and my homesickness, people generally accept it without a second thought. But when I mention that I believe these intense feelings that have brought me to tears are caused by psychological processes, I have on multiple occasions been told that it must not be a real identity. Some people have even treated my parallel life as just an elaborate fantasy rather than something that's completely real to me. I have word for word been told that there is no way I could identify as non human or be another species than human without believing I have a non human soul. A direct quote: to say I am Fae when you don't believe in Fae is illogical. What I take from these kinds of responses is that a subset of people within our community take it for granted that whatever beliefs someone has about the origin of their identity are objectively true, rather than understanding that our beliefs about our origins are just that, beliefs. Whatever conclusion we've reached based on our experiences, be that reincarnation or imprinting or something else entirely, and no matter how much we believe in it, it will always be a belief and never a fact. I'm fully convinced that my bison identity is caused by a past life, and that my Noel and Ben 10 identities are caused by my brain being weird. But if that doesn't fit into someone else's worldview, they have all the right in the world to explain it away however they want. I have friends who believe my bison identity must be caused by something psychological, and I have friends who believe my Knoll identity must be caused by something spiritual. That is their prerogative, as long as they don't try to tear down my lived reality. Religious tolerance is not that hard. If I can have a civil interview with a Mormon missionary about the reality they live in which Armageddon is literally coming, then surely you can have friendly chats with someone whose lived reality is being a Teletubby soul in a human body or psychologically imprinted on Elmo. None of these scenarios are more absurd than the other. It doesn't matter how people make sense of my non humanity as long as they're respectful towards my own experiences with my identity and don't try to impose their beliefs on me. If you have to quietly believe that someone really has a fairy soul in order to accept that they really are Fae, so be it. As long as you don't try to deny the reality of their current identity. Um, yeah, as long as you don't try to deny the reality of their current identity. As long as you don't try to claim that they aren't really non human just because they have the quote unquote wrong beliefs about their origin. There is another example of the animosity towards psychological otherkin that comes to mind. I originally left it out of this essay because it was fairly new and I didn't want its creator to be harassed, but it's been years now and I haven't seen the term since pandemic times. So I don't see why I shouldn't mention it. The term that was created was otherborn. So in 2020, the term otherborn was coined specifically to refer to those who believe they have a non human soul, which wouldn't be a problem in and of itself. After all, terms like anima fidem and cerebromalius have been around for a decade with no issue, which might be because they're impossible to pronounce, so no one wants to use them, but never mind. After all, no. However, otherborn is specifically described in its coining post as a less bastardized alternative to the word otherkin. What this post describes as less bastardized is spiritual experiences, and specifically those spiritual experiences that are based on soul transfers and reincarnation. Essentially, otherborn defines all other beliefs as bastardizations of what otherkinity is supposed to be. All beliefs, including spiritual beliefs that aren't based on souls or past lives, psychological beliefs, beliefs of becoming non-human, beliefs based on magic, neurological beliefs, and archetypal beliefs. None of these are quote unquote true otherkin according to the otherborn concept. The word thankfully never gained much traction off Tumblr, but I have seen individuals use it, and it always, without fail, makes me feel unwelcome and unwanted. Not because there's anything wrong with a strong belief in past lives or souls. After all, I am a bison by a reincarnation, and I like to believe I'm not a hypocrite. But because those who choose to use that label specifically believe themselves to be the only true non humans. Because the term itself is not based on a respectful individual belief, but on what its coiner believes to be an objective fact. Because this subset of our community has an almost evangelical conviction that all non humans have non human souls, and those who don't have non human souls are not non human. And like I mentioned earlier, the cause of otherkinity can affect the experience a lot. That's why we have these discussions in the first place. We come together due to our similarities and we try to understand each other and ourselves by discussing our differences. And this is exactly why proclaiming any version of non humanity as the one true kind of non humanity is so damaging. It completely stifles any exchange of ideas. It makes it impossible for us to understand our differences, and it leads to more and more narrowly defined subcommunities that all believe themselves to be more real than the others. To define is to limit. We need some limitations, otherwise, a dog is a cat and no words have meaning. But we need to be extremely careful where we want to draw our lines. Otherwise, we end up with a community where psychological otherkin are bastards, and only those who are born with non human souls are really non human. The next thing I want to discuss is subjective truth. Subjective truth is one of the most important concepts to understand and really internalize if we want fruitful discussions and respectful experience sharing. In short, a subjective truth is something that is not real because it can be proven to exist through scientific measurements, but is instead real because a person experiences it as real. If I make the claim that tea tastes better than coffee, which it does, for example, you cannot refute that equally true to say that coffee is better than tea and that tea is better than coffee. This is what I was talking about when I said that the born this way narrative and the becoming narrative are equally true. So, how does subjective truth apply to this discussion? A phenomenon in the community that I'm sure we're all aware of is kin memories. If you're somehow not aware of them, in short, they are images, episodes, sensory information, and so on that are thought to stem from another life, usually a past life. They have all the qualia of memories, except they didn't happen to the body currently recalling them. These experiences, though, are not restricted to those who believe their non humanity stems from a past life. They aren't even restricted to spiritual otherkin. Plenty of folks with psychological beliefs, mixed beliefs, and other beliefs report the exact same experience. Images, episodes, and sensory information that does not originate from this world or from this current life. For decades, there was a lexical gap in the community to describe these memories that aren't necessarily memories, which is where I can't avoid tooting my own horn a bit. I have an extremely rich and detailed parallel life as a Knoll from which I can quote unquote recall events, people, traditions, names, and so much more. And it's all integral to my non human identity. However, because I believe it all stems from some deep unconscious part of my brain, and because it feels like a parallel life, not a past life, I never felt right calling these things memories. So, almost 7 years ago at this point, I undertook the quest to fill that lexical gap. And after looking through dozens of obscure websites and dictionaries and articles, I found something useful. The word noema. Noema is, which is not pronounced neoma. Um, noema is a rarely used Greek word that translates to concept, idea, perception, or thought. And I've been very happy to see the term catching on in my corner of the community, where it's often used as a broader alternative to memory. In philosophy, a noema is defined as the perceived as it is perceived. At first, this might sound a bit vague or esoteric, but when looked at through the lens of subjective truth, it should start to make sense. A subjective truth is something that's real just because a person experiences it as real. A noema is the perceived as it is perceived. So when we're using noema as a substitute for memory, that is, when we're discussing experiences with the qualia of memories, and we choose to refer to them as noemata instead of referring to them as memories, the actual cause of the noema is made irrelevant. The only thing that matters is that it's in one way or another perceived as a memory. When talking about noemata, it's completely and utterly irrelevant if they're real in any objective way. The only thing that matters is that the individual experiences the noema as real. Essentially, the word noema makes the cause irrelevant so we can instead focus on the experience alone. And I think the fact that this word has caught on somewhat on Tumblr um, hints that our community may be moving in a positive direction. Fingers crossed, claws, talents, etc. crossed, we can get the other sub-communities on board. I at least dream of a community where we care a lot less about our origins and a lot more about our current presence in the world. Shortly before writing the original version of this essay, I had a conversation with a friend about the community wide worry about the origins of our identity. And just to reiterate, I'm not saying your spiritual beliefs are irrelevant because they can be really important when forming a whole picture of your identity. I'm more so saying that they can be a bit of a distraction. In my opinion, the whole discussion about spirituality versus psychology is a red herring. Most of us didn't seek out the community because we had certain spiritual beliefs. We sought it out because we felt not quite human. And it was only later that we reached any conclusions about why we feel non human. So, my friend and I talked about the role this discussion of origins plays in our community, and we reached a few interesting conclusions. For starters, it's really upsetting to some folks to have to earnestly consider the idea that reincarnated souls are no more real or valid than psychological imprinting or any other non spiritual beliefs for that matter. That's part of what started the whole otherborn idea I mentioned earlier. And it seems this uncomfortableness stems from a place of insecurity. At the risk of offending some folks, I'm gonna draw a parallel to the trans community. In the trans community, there is a discussion of origins that parallels the one in the kin community, and is likewise an attempt to draw lines between the quote unquote real trans people and the so-called transgenders, which are supposedly people who pretend to be trans for clout. Those who attempt to draw these lines proclaim that being trans is a medical condition that they wouldn't wish on their worst enemy, and one that's marked by intense dysphoria and stress. They'll also regularly state that being trans is only real or valid because it has been proven through MRI brain scans that some female assigned people have supposedly male brains and vice versa. And just to make things clear, those brain scans are not real. It's malicious pseudoscience spread by people who want to cure transness, often by preventing trans kids from being born. Um, but I think this attempt at validating your identity, in this case with science, stems from a dislike of one's own traits, or more likely from the outside world's dislike of those traits. When certain trans people try to prove themselves more valid than others in the eyes of the public, it's not because they just hate those they deem not trans enough. It's because they're afraid of being rejected by the rest of the world. These people are basically saying, I didn't choose to be trans. This is how I was born. So you have to accept it because it's unchangeable. It's a cry for acceptance in an unaccepting world. And all this is not to say that some trans people aren't born trans. I really think most trans people have a narrative like that. I'm also trying to get across that someone else's narrative of choice should have no impact on your narrative of involuntarity. Both are real ways to experience being trans. And in many ways, having a narrative of choosing to be trans is necessary for the community because it closes the door for eugenicists who try to eliminate, quote unquote, the trans gene. Viewing transness as a purely medical phenomenon where you need to meet certain requirements to get a trans diagnosis is a really reductive way to look at identity. Like I mentioned earlier, an identity is not just the sum of its parts, and it cannot be summarized by being forced by birthright to feel dysphoria. The fact of the matter is that we don't know trans people are real because we have brain imaging technology, or even because certain people meet the medical criteria for having gender dysphoria. We know trans people are real because there are real people who identify as trans. We should be able to trust that people are trans when they tell us they are. And I think we need to look at non-human identities the same way. Before I move on to the conclusion, I want to explain why this topic became so important to me. So, back in 2020, after a good year or two of introspection, I realized that I had created a heart type. Not a kin type, but nonetheless an equally integral part of how I view myself and engage with the world. And changing something so fundamental about myself sent my thoughts racing. When I was a kid, I picked up a fear of spiders. It wasn't bad enough to give me panic attacks, but it was bad enough that I couldn't just pick up a spider and carry it outside, even though I could do so with other bugs. I was around 10 years old when I decided that this was dumb and I wanted to change it. So, as a tween, I began my own exposure therapy, like looking at photos of spiders and reading about them and photographing them in nature. And after several years, it had gotten to the point where I barely had a reaction to seeing them. But as I continued on getting used to the idea of holding them and touching them, something changed in me. Where I had previously felt fear, I started to feel admiration and love and a sense of familiarity. I wanted to surround myself with these animals. I wanted to work with them. And I started spending a not insignificant amount of money on terrariums. And now, after more than a decade of rewiring my own thoughts and changing a mild fear into a love so deep it affects my very sense of self, I feel confident saying I created a heart type. It was not an easy process. Like I said, it took more than a decade. Changing your entire mindset like that can't be done with just a snap of your fingers. But evidently, some people are able to do it. Though I have to add, even here, it's very easy to argue that there was some level of involuntarity. I already had an emotional response to spiders when I was scared of them. I don't think I could form this kind of relationship with something I'm completely indifferent to, like, I don't know, a Toyota or a Homestuck character. You can't really form a relationship from nothing. And I appreciate this argument because it really highlights just how confusing the entire concept of choice is and how it doesn't make sense to define ourselves by our lack of choice when we can't even define what counts as a choice. But yeah, realizing that I created a hard type, an identity that at the time was widely and against the original definition, I might add, considered involuntary. Um, Realizing that I didn't just play a part in creating this identity, but that I created it, period. It sent my mind spinning, and I couldn't stop thinking about what else might be possible. If I could create such a love in myself, could I also do the opposite and tear down my own heart type and recreate the phobia? Not something I want to test, but I think I could. And which other identities could be created like this? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the creation process has no impact on the nature of the identity itself. And I ended up posting a really controversial thing on Tumblr at the time. In hindsight, I understand why some people got so pissed off about it, but I still stand by those thoughts. I'll read it to you in full here. Theoretically, I probably could force myself not to be otherkin, but it would take a decade or more, the way my hard type creation did, and it would require constant work throughout those years. However, I see no way I would benefit from that work the way I did when I unintentionally created a hard type in the process of getting rid of a phobia. It would just rid me of a part of myself that's intrinsic to how I recognize myself. That's not something I in any way want. And because I don't want it, and because the choice would have to happen continuously on a timescale I can barely comprehend, I couldn't make that choice in practicality. A very long and very complicated discussion came out of this post that I'd need a whole separate lecture to recap. But a few important ideas were developed, which I need to mention here. For starters, when discussing shadow work and the Jungian archetypes, Jasper accidentally coined the term ego alteration, which some of you oldies might remember. Through that discussion, we ended up defining ego alteration as the process by which you proactively alter your conscious mind, your self perception, and your thought patterns. It's not something to be taken lightly, as you'll essentially be changing your sense of self by it. And it's also not something everyone has the ability, desire, or drive to do. To integrate something into your sense of self or to remove something that's currently a part of your sense of self is serious business. And like my heart type creation, is something that should be thought about on a decade-long time scale. I don't have time to go in depth about it here, but to consciously change your identity and your sense of self is definitely possible for some folks. And it's nice to have a name for the concept. Something else that came out of that discussion is my own thoughts about how we define otherkin. The most common definition I've seen is to identify wholly or partially as something non-human on a non-physical level by no choice of your own. And I think we should just drop the last bit. Um, it's a bit more complicated than just deleting a few words. In order to drop the by no choice of your own bit without losing the meaning of otherkinity completely and letting kin for fun take over, we'd need to rethink the entire definition. Instead of defining otherkin by the amount of choice we had in the formation of our identity, I suggest we define otherkin by how integral our identities are to us. A pretty big source of conflict is that kin for fun just don't understand the gravity of otherkin identities. If we define otherkinity as something that's inseparable from who we are as individuals, it would not only make it clear to kin for fun that this is, well, it's not for fun. Um, it would also get around the problem of people who worry that their identities might be invalid because they've made certain choices. Your otherkinity is inherent, and by that I mean you would be a fundamentally different person if not for your kin type. At its most basic level, your kin type is what you recognize yourself to be. It's the kind you belong to rather than or in tandem with belonging to humankind. Your kin type is an intrinsic part of you, and even if you could get rid of it, doing so would fundamentally change who you are as a person. If you chose not to be otherkin, you would also choose not to be you. In that sense, I suppose otherkinity is involuntary in that you yourself cannot choose not to be otherkin, because as soon as you make that choice, you aren't you. Though you could also argue that it is a choice because you wake up every day and choose to be you, and thus the topic of choice leaves us running around in circles like it always has. Being otherkin, being otherkind, has never been about being forced to feel species dysphoria. It's about being of another kind. It's about knowing and recognizing humankind and accepting that in one way or another that does not describe us. And all this is not to say that coping linking shouldn't be a concept, but we need to rethink that as well. From the very few coping link writings that exist, one topic I've seen several times is the idea of coping links becoming inseparable from you. This was not the intended purpose of links, and those who do go through a change like that usually find themselves at home in the kin community, often more so than the link community. If we want these two words to make sense and have a use, we need to redefine both. I suggest defining coping links and other links by their lack of integrality. The line that has been drawn between otherkin and coping linkers doesn't help anyone as it is. There are far too many non-humans who straddle the line, who feel torn between either community, or who only call themselves linkers because they feel pressure to do so. There are far too many non-humans who don't feel they have a community they can call home. So I'm going to propose a different and much more inclusive definition. To be otherkin is to identify as something non-human on an integral level. There you go, clean and simple. No more caveats or nested sentences. The end. If any of you have any comments or questions or addendums or criticisms, anything, you need to come out with it now, because it will probably be another 5 years before I perform this essay again. Thanks for all the nice words, everyone. So I was so focused on reading, I didn't check the chat at all. Let's see if anyone posted in panel questions. I don't think so. Yeah. Okay. Will this essay script be released to reread afterwards? I imagine I changed the script a bit from the one on my website. So I think I'll add it to the same page as the original one, but as a toggle, so you can toggle if you want to read the original one or the new version. And then Calix asks, my only follow-up is, how does one determine integrality? That's something only you can choose. No, only you can determine. I mean, do you feel like losing this part or adding this part would change who you are as a person? That's the best way I can word it, which I know is kind of vague and not overly helpful, but that's the nature of the kind of identities we're discussing here. You're all so nice. Oh. Oh, and I didn't even give you a dead baby joke for this panel. I usually do that. I forgot all of them. Actually, fun story. Since writing this essay, I have gained what I call an involuntary other link as a horse. Um, and back before I wrote this essay, I would have said involuntary coping link. Isn't that just a kin type or a stereotype? But now I think of it more as like horse is something that's it's not a core part of my identity. It's more like putting on a really comfortable mask, whereas bison is deeply intimate. I don't feel like horse is intimate the same way that bison is. I think that's the best way to distinguish between the two. I see other people with involuntary coping links. That's nice. We still got about 9 minutes left, I think. Um, so, I mean, anyone's welcome to raise a paw or hoof or whatever if you want to talk. Um, I think we're at that point where it's just like a casual, informal talk. I'm lying on my bed in my pajamas. um, oh, we got a question here. Again from Calixa. Hi. Do you think that if you link something hard enough, it will inevitably become a kin type then? Well, I don't think there's anything inevitable about it. I think sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't. And you just have to check in with yourself and see if something about your relationship with the type has changed. Um, like if it's become too much a part of you that losing it would change fundamentally who you are as a person. But I mean, you can go all in on it without it becoming a kin type, I think. I'm currently making a horse mask. I've never done that for any of my other kin types. I say horse mask, it's more of a pony thing, if you know what I mean, but still. Gilman says, I call them a fun link because it's very fun more than anything else, but it's still involuntary. I kind of feel the same way about my inner horse. It feels very playful and light in a way that bison doesn't. Bison is just like, I mean, I go to work as a bison and I buy groceries as a bison. And I mean, I can do that as a horse too, but when a horse is just a lot more, yeah, playful, fun. I'm very pleased to see you all using the word paratype too. That's one of my other children. Thanks to Veed for always spreading the word about paratypes. A creature called Lynx asks, paratype? Which is a full question. Paratype is like um, any connection you have that only exists because it's connected to another one of your identities. So, like, um, if you are a lion, you might feel a very strong connection to zebras because they were your primary prey. If you're a collie, like a border collie, you might feel a very strong connection to uh, Australian shepherds because they're very similar dogs. Um, if you're a lizard, you may have a very strong connection to the sun because it kept you alive. It's like it's a word I came up with because I kept getting kin feelings from every bovine I came across, and I was like, I can't be a bison therian and a cow therian and a yak therian and a gower therian, so I created the word paratype just to compartmentalize every bovine that gave me kin feelings, so it didn't end up with like 20 kin types. Well, you could be a cladotherian, I guess, but I don't get any of those feelings from like uh Nialas and kudus. They're bovines too. They just look too different. So if I were a cladotherian, I would be a paraphyletic clade, and I don't fuck with those. Not the kind of gar I was talking about, Paige. Gaur. But yeah, I see why someone would just call that cladotherianthropy. It's it's basically um two different ways to compartmentalize basically the same experience. Mm, did anyone link the Noema essay? Otherwise, I'm gonna do that in just a second because I feel like I talk about that enough in this choice or chance essay that it's kind of relevant. Oh god, no, my website looks fucky again. Why does my HTML always get fucked up when I least expect it? There we go. That's the essay. Gonna grab the link and paste. Please don't view my website on mobile phone because the top bar looks weird right now, and I don't know what happened. I'm not good friends with my CSS. Speed linking con event would straight up go so hard. I agree. It would be so fun. I mean, that's kind of what we were talking about in the fiction folk roundup. Like, we gotta create some links so we can win more of these roundups. Like, I have to create an Enkidu link so I can win oldest Fictomere next year. So I guess Orion has everyone beat on oldest Victomere with that Pleiades star system constellation thing, whatever. We gotta min-max link times for competitions. Exactly. Oh, it's not actually. You shouldn't tell us that, Orion. Just keep pretending it's a Victomere so you can keep winning. It's okay to lie. At least in competitions. I can assign anyone kin types. Paige, you don't need to ask for a kin type. We all know you're a fox. You're asking for it, Paige. Silent. I mean, it's pretty obvious. You're a xylophone. Like, why do you keep asking for these obvious? Come on. Pandora, you're a box. Like, give me a hard one. Jude, you're a judge. Judge Judy. Judgekin. Actually, another essay I'd been thinking about writing for like 5 years was one arguing for the whole concept of jobkin, because I remember a long time ago on Tumblr there was a whole debacle about, can you really be piratekin? Can you really be knightkin? That's just like someone's job. It's like being cashierkin. But I don't see why you can't also be cashierkin. Yeah, exactly. Archetrope are real. But yeah, the community discussion has kind of moved beyond that now with the whole event of archetype being defined. Um, yeah. Gilman. I've never heard that term before. Arcuden, I think that's how it's pronounced. Can you explain that? I mean, if we want to have a oh, it's not archetypy, but it's when having a certain occupation is very important to you. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. I remember someone got really mad at me when I called myself an entomologist once because I only have a bachelor's. That made me sad because it was very important to me. It's not anymore. Now I have more um now I have greater values in life, but at the time, um maybe we should just have a whole event next year where I assign people kin types based on my 2-second impression of them. Everyone seems to want one. Neve says occupation can definitely be part of one's identity. I'm an audio engineer. Choosing not to be an audio engineer would take something very significant away from who I am. Yeah, exactly. Especially if it's in one way or another related or associated with your other identities. Um, yeah, I think that's why it hurt so bad when someone told me I can't call myself an entomologist that time, because spiders are so important to me. I guess I should call myself an arachnologist then, but I wrote my thesis on mealworms, which are beetles, so who cares? It's in the past. Thank you, everyone. We're actually over time now. Does the when do the closing ceremonies begin? Can anyone remember? I could keep talking forever. I'm in my zone right now. But yeah, we should probably end now so everyone can get ready for the closing ceremonies. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, my captive audience.